Hi, everybody. We're going to cover Southeast Asia today, and here is our co-host, Austin Paget. And I'm going to be perfectly blunt. This is not a particularly historically decisive or dramatic era of history. I am not going to lie to you. That is not my place. And I've read thousands of pages in this topic, and I have a map I made of the birthplace. I have every episode of History 102, and I was bored, so I made a map of the most important person for each time period and where they're clustered. And you find very consistently Europe is hugely overrepresented. And that's partly a reflection. I am a person of European ancestry, and it's also a reflection of historic reality. And even for time periods that I would say are not concentrated in Europe. They'll have their most important person of that time period born in Europe. So for colonial America, Sir William Berkeley was born in England. For colonial Spain, Hernan Cortez was born in Spain. Stuff like that. Or Marco Polo. I marked Marco Polo as the most important person in the Silk Road, the most decisive person in the history of the Silk Road historically. And you can argue about that, but he's the most famous person, and he's from Italy. But I look at Southeast Asia, and I've read like half a dozen books on this topic, and I cannot name nearly any pre-industrial Southeast Asian leaders. Like there's Jaivarman, and when I do know leaders from this time period, it's from like a civilization game. And so I'm gonna be perfectly blunt. You guys are aware of my limitations, and I study this because my background's anthropology, where I was really interested in Southeast Asia because my evolutionary strategy is I try to find games without competitors and then offer people useful services. So I like studying topics no one else has talked about and then bringing them to the public. And the thing that got me into Southeast Asia is that from an anthropology background, you have a bunch of different cultural metrics, but there's normally a certain cultural line for almost all anthropological traits. And this is partly a sampling issue, I could explain it, but it's always America and the Protestant Europeans on this side for any trait, and then it's Japan and Southeast Asia on the other side. And I was just curious, Southeast Asia is what happens when you are as far away from Western civilization as possible. Because even for the Muslims or the Chinese, you can see traits in common with Europe. But the thing I found so fascinating about Southeast Asia is it's looking at a society that is so fundamentally different from ours that it kind of teaches you truths about human nature because you see the exact other side of human nature.
That's funny you mentioned Japan because I always thought Japan was the most different place I'd ever been to because it was very industrialized, very modern, completely modern and beyond modern cities, but there was something different about them. So it was
Yeah.
like the familiarity made it almost even more strange versus Southeast Asia. I could kind of chalk
Yes.
up to more extremely different cultural expressions. But when you see something done similarly and it still be different, then it really uncovers some deep underlying.
Yes. That's a great point because anthropology is often incredibly paradoxical. And I think the paradoxes of life, reality is innately paradoxical. And so the human experience reflects that. Where, for example, I'm a Celt, I'm from an honor culture, and I look at the Japanese. According to most cultural metrics, the Japanese and the Celts are the exact opposite. However, you see these hollow similarities where they horseshoe, like obsession with honor, obsession with fighting to the death, obsession with pride of craftsmanship, that stuff. And that's how anthropology works. And I see it with because I've gone through a phase in my life where I thought all Americans are the same, and then I thought America was super different, and I leaned more on people are super different across America because when I was in Los Angeles had the thing you described. It was close enough to Pennsylvania that I could recognize it. Like we speak the same language, same currency, a lot of the same movies and culture. And then when you can see the similarities, you realize, wait, we are actually very different.
Yeah, it's funny. Again, going into the paradox, it's true that everyone around the world is actually similar. There are similarities. There's underlying
Yeah.
grains that you can relate to, and there's underlying patterns that humans tend to engage in, but there's also differences. So you can say both those things and be right, and you have to
Yes.
look into it. Because, like in Thailand, for example, I found very, very little different. between the socialist eco-monarchists arguments and the American New York left ecosystem that I grew up in. It
Explain.
was a very similar ideology. Just basically technocracy, managed economy. They also have this thing going on where they'll look at Asia got successful from adopting property rights, and then they look at Europe and America and see these big regulated economies, and they think the same thing we do often, which is that, oh, unless we get these similar institutions and regulate our food or something, then we're never going to reach the standards of the West. When it's really the opposite, where the standards are driven by the underlying the distribution of technology and knowledge within society.
Yeah.
And you can't set a standard beyond the level that that society is able to function at. So if you
Yes.
applied American farm regulations onto Thailand, you would close down 60% of their farms. Or if you applied child labor laws, which weren't passed in the US or Europe until it was basically eliminated to India, then you get an increase in child labor in the black market. So it's kind of like all the arguments are the same in both
Yeah.
places from when I'm talking politics.
Yeah, you gave me a really interesting story when I was at your place where you said that in Thailand, or no, I think it might be Sri Lanka, when they banned child labor, the rate of child labor went up because what they found in that country, as well as across history in the developing world, is the second countries get wealthier enough to do it, parents immediately make their kids stop working. It's like automatic. It's one of the most baseline things for a developing country because parents don't want to see their kids work. It's also, you see it with women as well, where in the 1800s, middle and upper class women didn't work, and that was because work was fucking disgusting. You were in an industrial, you were in a mine, you were working in a factory, and so it was seen as like a protecting your woman thing. And the other thing you said is that when they had the child labor laws, child labor increased because the parents couldn't get the labor from their children working legally. So they were forced to have the children work illegally because they would starve if they didn't. And it's this whole thing where I say follow the Tao to both wealth and wisdom. The Tao was in the Dow Jones and the Tao was in Taoism because there is
Oh,
the
that's funny.
innate force of life and you follow the force of life. And sometimes your people are poor and the kids have to work, and that's just the nature of life, and you should accept it.
Yes, and we are able to kind of hide from the conditions of nature, but coming right out of that, I mean, Bangkok is a completely modern, huge city. It has more sophisticated European food in the grocery stores than you'll find in America. But 20 years ago, they were using elephants for construction.
Yeah,
I mean, these are extremely rapid shifts. It's kind of amazing to see because it's one thing when you see Austin pop up or something, you see the time lapse of the American city construction. It's another thing when something like New York pops up in what was previously a rural undeveloped area.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, you're totally right. And we're hitting a lot of different useful themes for this topic because a really funny thing is that as I've read out the historiography of Southeast Asia, and historiography is the science of how you write history, um, they both the right and the left had to rationalize why there was no change over a 1,000 year period. So from 800 in Southeast Asia until 1800, there was very little social change. Or that's half true, where at the same time you saw the organization of centralized states with bureaucracies and greater trade routes. It was developing upwards, so there was change, but at the same time, from the outside, it didn't appear like it. And the rightist narrative was basically the Southeast Asians were lazy, and the leftist narrative was that their innate folk ways were so well adapted to their environment they didn't have to change. And when you look at Southeast Asia, you're seeing a couple different things. And a binary we keep on touching is something that James Scott's the man. I'm going to continue shilling him. He's a really important libertarian philosopher. And this book, The Art of Not Being Governed, is a I wish there were more books written like this. It's an anarchist history of Southeast Asia, and the thesis he talks about is that Southeast Asia has this critical duality between the mountain tribal peoples and the state land empires. And what he talks about is that these land empires developed around rice cultivation in the river valleys, and they were slave states. Where in 18th century Thailand and Burma, three-quarters of the population were slaves. They would have these tropical societies invariably tend to be slave societies where they brand your forehead with the mark of your master so you can't run away. And so you have these slave states that were the main generative civilizational force where they built the temples and they did the trading and they had the empires. And they were built off taking people from the mountains as slaves. And there was this critical duality between the slave peoples and the free mountain peoples. And the free mountain peoples were, I'm going to be blunt, they were barbarians. And they would have these messianic religious cults built around radical Buddhism where they'd fight wars against the valley people. And the thesis the book keeps touching on is that these two are in critical tension. And frontiers bring about freedom or slavery, where you saw the mirror image of both freedom and slavery. And they had more in common with each other than they realized because they were trading. They were people who knew the other way's way of life. And this is one of the best written anthropology books I've ever read.
That also gets back to our theme of things being similar around the world, right? Like
Yeah,
so many of these themes of industrialization we're seeing parallel perfectly with Thailand, with the rural areas being more conservative and the
yeah,
cities being more liberal. And it's the same with the ancient history where you have the mountain versus valley people, constant struggle.
yeah. So the way Southeast Asia started is Southeast Asia is always cursed to be stuck between the two suns of China and India, where the way the Orient works is that China and India both have, so historic India is not the borders of current India. Historic India has nearly 2 billion people, and China's got 1.5 billion, or actually, no, it's way lower because they're lying about their numbers. But these are lots of people. And this last video we talked on the Silk Road, I had this story from the 1600s where um, the king of Goa in South India, or it might not be Goa, it's like Travancore, some neighboring state. He was talking to the king of Siam or Thailand, and he said, "Your land is bigger than mine, but I rule people and you rule mosquitoes." And that was saying Southeast Asia doesn't have people because in the pre-industrial world, China had 100 million people. This is like the year 1600. China had 100 million people and India had like 100 million people. And then Thailand had like 3 million people or like 4 million people. And so it was just this hugely depopulated area between India and China. And India and China had to trade, and they were part of the Silk Road system that led out to Europe and the Middle East. And Southeast Asia is this very interesting place where, first of all, it's fucking huge. Indonesia, and this is the thing you have to realize, in a place like Northwest Europe, there's too much pressure inside the equilibrium. And so it just results in these constant wars because the Dutch are next to the English, we're next to the Germans, next to the French, all these aggro peoples stuck on too little land. And it built up this critical tension. In Southeast Asia, it's the exact opposite. It's not enough people spread over too much land in a place where the soil wasn't fertile and where it's always hot all year. And so when you look at Southeast Asia, you're seeing a place that didn't have enough centripetal forces to give it the basically suffering to propel it to make its own civilization. So it's permanently stuck in this limbo between significantly larger civilizations, and Southeast Asia is going to get. We're going to see four different civilizations play with Southeast Asia, and when you're looking at this time period, you're seeing these small river valley civilizations stuck in an infinite line of jungle, where the distance from west coast of Sumatra to New Guinea is London to Kyrgyzstan. It's wider across than the United States. And just New Guinea, which looks tiny on the map, stretches from London to Moscow.
Right, and it's island hopping. It's all broken up. I wonder how populated the area was before the end of the Ice Age, right? When it was all one continent. It's pretty
Yeah.
crazy because it was probably the widest, most fertile area in the entire world.
Interesting.
around
Wow.
the Ice Age, and then it shrunk to basically only reveal the mountaintops of
Huh.
this previous continent, and that is what Southeast Asia is today, is people living on the mountaintops of that continent, and the water is really shallow in between all the islands, which makes for, a pretty amazing area. But I was shocked going to places like Indonesia because you see there's 300 million people on this island, 250 million, something like
That
that.
much?
Yeah, 250 million people in Indonesia. So you're thinking, how how do they like fit? There must be,
They're all in
extreme
Java.
land constraints. But you'd be surprised at how much it concentrates in the urban area. I was in the mountains outside of Jakarta, just 3 hours outside of Jakarta, an endless landscape of rolling mountains,
Yeah.
geysers putting up smoke, and there were tea farms and a rose greenhouse we were visiting.
Hmm.
Uh, and I mean, nature going on for as long as you can see. You can get lost in jungles in Thailand and
Yeah.
Myanmar. There's a surprising amount of nature there for the population, and I think it also relates to the fact that it's a lot of mountaintops, right? There's not going to be a lot of people living in roll on the top of rolling mountains, full of geysers, almost completely inaccessible except for by a boulder road.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you're totally right. And that's a beautiful way of putting it. And I cannot state how fucking hot it is there, where it's the hottest place I've lived in the world. It's 95 all day, or 110 all day, all year. And I was jogging at midnight, and I couldn't jog at midnight because it was so fucking hot. I was constantly sweating through
Yeah.
at midnight.
It's
And
not, oh yeah, I was gonna say it's not just the heat, it's also the sun, which is related to
yeah,
the heat, and the way it hits your eyes is totally different. I was
yeah,
joking with these Thai guys when we were in the jungle because I literally couldn't see. Like I was completely blinded by the sun, and I was
yeah.
saying, if we had to hunt something right now, I would die with these
Yeah,
eyes.
exactly.
Would not be able to survive
This
here.
is one of the taboo topics that we all know is real, but you really wonder how much race modulates how you perceive temperature. Because as a Briton, I would fucking die in Thailand from the heat. But then somehow the locals go out and farm every day, and we know this is real because the second whites moved to the climate of North Africa, which isn't even tropical, which is the American South, they started importing blacks within the first 5 years of working there. So this is one of the, I have a buddy who's an anthropologist who thinks that race modulates temperature 20%. So basically, if you're a white person and it feels 100 outside, if you're a Thai person, it feels like, and my anthropologist friend, he's assessed this, he thinks the Thais and the Sahelians are the two populations most immune to heat. And he says that it's probably a 20-point difference. So if it's 100 degrees for us, it feels 80 degrees for them.
Right, which is a huge
It is, yeah.
shift. Yeah.
So Southeast Asia is stuck in this permanent limbo of being stuck between bigger civilizations. And so in a lot of ways, the story of Southeast Asia is the story of them going through waves of integrating different civilizations. And there's the Indic, the Chinese, the Muslim, and then the Western. And modern Southeast Asia was formed around the same time as Northwest Europe, around 600, 700 AD. This book, Strange Parallels by Victor Lieberman, there are certain topics that get a way better author than you deserve. So, 17th century Eastern Europe's that. Same thing with um, topics relating to some. You'll get some stuff like American ethnography or history, like the history of there's an amazing history of the politics of climate in the 17th century Caribbean. You just run as these topics where such a skilled historian stumbled on it that you just have to be grateful and say, thank you, sir. Thank you for writing this book. And this book is awesome. It's a history of comparing Southeast Asian political development to West European political development. And it happened at the same time at the same scale. So in the 1600s, when the French monarchy was unifying, in Thailand, they were also like the French, building a bureaucratic state built around the king partying with people, with a centralized military using a capitalist trade class to push it. Or Thailand had its own equivalent to Napoleon, or like a military dictator in the early 1800s who conquered a lot of the neighboring territory. Or he compares Burma to Queen Elizabeth, where they had this big, or like more the Spanish Empire. Burma had its own empire in the late 1500s, and the next book after this is mainland Southeast Asia. The next book's on Indonesia, and in the next book he compares Southeast Asia to all of Eurasia to show that basically all of humanity goes through certain cultural shifts at similar times where it's almost astrological. Like you'll see that in the 1600s, everyone's having a war in 1645. They're building a bureaucratic state. They're unifying the society. In 1000 AD, like civilization spreads out of the 40th parallel. You have religious breakthroughs. You have innate capitalism arising. And I'm super excited to talk about this to the public, but the public will get way too excited with this stuff. They'll overcorrect if this is popular, and they'll constantly look for these similarities across history. And then that's just how humans are. We constantly overdo stuff.
Right. And there is some connection, right? Like we were talking about with the Silk Road yesterday. Southeast Asia was an absolutely key part of the Silk Road because
Yeah.
it connected China to India. Um,
Yes.
and a lot of the former the big civilizations in the like Thai Myanmar Peninsula were trading civilizations connected
Yeah.
to that route. That's how Bagan got big and everything.
Yes. And so, as I said before, Southeast Asia arose at the same time as Western Europe, and they built up states in a similar way, where their capitalism was formed by Buddhist monasteries in the same way our capitalism was made by Catholic monks. Because the Catholic monks made the first factories, or that they not really factories, they had big centers for production, and there was the formation of these various states. And the thing with Southeast Asia is that the mountain peoples, they were constantly being predated upon later by the valley peoples, but then the mountain peoples kept conquering the valley peoples. The mountain peoples were innately tougher and they weren't pacified, so they were very successful at conquering the valley peoples. And for example, the Thai people, the Thai are indigenous to Yunnan in China. They've been gradually pushed south by the Chinese monarchy, and as the Chinese monarchy conquered into Yunnan, it pushed all of these Southeast Asian peoples into conquering the lowlands. Same thing with Burma, where Burma built its national identity much like England in the 11th century, as there was a ruling class from Yunnan who conquered into there, the Shan, I believe, and then they became the ruling class. And these identity formations in Southeast Asia came from single ethnicities conquering other ones. And so in Burma, there was the gradual formation of this centralized Burmese identity from 10 different groups. And the first state to get really big was Khmer, or Thailand, sorry, Khmer or Cambodia. And then the first major population center is you had one in Champa at the mouth of the Mekong River, and Bagan at the mouth of the Irrawaddy in Burma. I'm sure I'm pronouncing these wrong. I apologize, but I do dozens of these shows. And Bagan, and so both of these were due to trade from India, because the downstream effects of Hinduism and Buddhism from India were what made state formation in Southeast Asia. Because India was a sun, and India was an incredibly dynamic civilization in this time period. It was possibly the most in the world in the Dark Age period. And what happened is that Indian merchants would go to Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia's main economic purpose for this whole time period was supplying luxuries to the rest of the world, where China had a ridiculously large luxury market, and Southeast Asia's economy was completely dependent upon China's economy, where whenever China would have state failures, there would be a crisis that would ripple across Southeast Asia, wiping out the ruling regimes, because the ruling regimes were very heavily dependent upon exporting luxuries to China. And you had stuff like sandalwood, and you had the Spice Islands were here, which were an incredibly valuable asset in Indonesia. You had elephant horns, you had all of these, like the Chinese were addicted to these kinds of like sea urchin or like sea leech. I don't fucking know, man. That there was this huge delicacy in medieval China, and so Southeast Asia was economically dependent on this. And these Indian merchants would leave India, and they would go to Southeast Asia and started talking to the local kings, and the local kings established authority to trade with the Indians. Because what happens when the Indian merchants show up, they need a stable authority to get resources. So the guy at the mouth of the river is chieftain, and then he uses Indian political theory to appoint himself Raja. And so the Indians had this prepackaged civilization the Southeast Asians could take in order to interact with them. And from that, you saw the formation of these replica Indian kingdoms in Southeast Asia, where they worshipped Indian gods, they would wear the fashion of Indian kings, they would use Indian political theory, they'd speak to each other in Sanskrit. Sanskrit was the written language. And this was a process that was entirely peaceful. I rarely say that historically. There's always violence in history. But it was one of the more peaceful cultural exchanges ever in human history. And through that, you saw the formation of states across Southeast Asia. There was one based around the Irrawaddy in Burma. There was one based around Champa at the mouth of the Mekong. There was the Dong Song Kingdom in Vietnam, which one of my favorite historians, McNeill speaks so highly of the Dong Song. He says they probably reached America in the Dark Age period, and you see these cultural similarities in Mexican art and Dong Song art that are very stark, and also they were incredibly advanced mariners. And so McNeill's no joke. He's possibly the greatest historian of the last century. When he says something, you should listen. McNeill said the Dong Song reached Mexico and influenced the formation of Mexican civilization, which occurred at a roughly similar time, or there was a major breakthrough in Mexican civilization. So the final state was in Java, where Java is kind of weird, where it's just Java is one of the most populous places in the world, 200 million people. And Java is thousands of miles from any other important population center. Because keep in mind, Malaysia, Indonesia, these were mostly jungle. And you have these forts along the coast in places like Sumatra or Borneo that were there for luxury production, but they had almost no people. So the nearest population center to Java was Thailand, which is probably like, I don't know, thousands of miles away. But Java had this. Let me see how far Jakarta is from Jakarta to Bangkok. But
I would guess
Java,
England to Italy or something.
no, it's got to be way more than that. Yeah, it's 3,000 kilometers. But
1 or
yeah,
2 hours
so
like.
wait, I gotta find this. I'm stuck. But
I'm trying to think of the flight times between Thailand and all the
yeah,
areas.
it's 1,500 miles. In 1,500 miles, I think it's Philadelphia to it's Philadelphia to like Arkansas. But yeah, so Java had that fellow Graham Hancock. He talks about like Ice Age sites in Java. That's not true. They're really from. They had some sites before the birth of Christ. You should expect that civilization in tropical climates is vastly older than you think, because their archaeological institutions aren't equal to their depth of their history. So I would guess there was some civilization in Java before the birth of Christ, and they also kicked in a similar time frame as the rest of Southeast Asia.
Interesting. And that's funny you say they mentioned America or reached America because going back to the origin of Southeast Asian civilization, right, is you had the Aborigines kind of dominating that area
Yeah.
and the Hokkaido dominating the coast of East Asia. And then those are kind of the groups that ended up
Yeah.
populating North America through the ice bridge was the Hokkaido. And then the Aborigines got pushed all the way down to um,
Yes.
New Zealand. And maybe it was
You mean Australia?
Australia. And then maybe it was the Asians from the north that settled Southeast Asia
Yeah.
after the Aborigines that actually populated South America versus in the north, it was the first coastal Asians to get kicked out that populated North
Yes.
America.
Yes, that's some rare knowledge you have that the indigenous inhabitants of Southeast Asia were Australian Aboriginals. And that was true until several thousand years ago. And ironically, we find that Australian Aboriginal Southeast Asian population in finds in the Amazon 7,000 years ago, because they were instrumental in the migration over the ice bridge to the New World in the last ice age. So it's why my mom, when she took a DNA test, was 0.1% Pacific Islander, and that's because I had a Cherokee ancestor in the 18th century, and Native ancestry matches up with Cherokee a little bit. And the yes, there was this. There are several migrations in this region, and they are genetically mostly Chinese people originally, and then they displaced the Aboriginals. But the further south you go, there's a strict racial line between Phuket and Bangkok. Because further south in Phuket, the people look brown, and then up in Thailand, there's people who could basically be Chinese. I watch Southeast
Yeah.
Asian pop music, and like their standard of beauty is to be Chinese. I apologize for telling you this, but I must tell you reality.
Right.
Where you see with
That's where the whiteness comes from because
yes,
the Chinese are more pale. Also, the rural lack of sun thing, but that just exacerbates that
yes,
genetic component.
it's like the Bollywood stars in India all look Persian, which is hilarious because they hate the Muslims so much. So the distance between Bangkok and Jakarta is actually the exact same distance between Philadelphia and Austin. For those that don't know, I'm from Philly and I moved to Austin. But state formation, Southeast Asia. And with Champa, up the river from Champa, and Champa was, they call it Cochin, China, which is an example of the trade systems. Cochin, South India, and China is China. And so South Vietnam, which is this completely culturally distinct region that should never have been part of Vietnam, it was conquered in the 1700s. They just called it South China, South India, China, because it's halfway between, and they saw it as this stopping spot. And
It's still like that today.
huh,
When
yeah,
China loses, China's been losing a lot of lower level manufacturing for about a decade, and it all flows through Vietnam first. It's
huh,
the easiest place to port it. And then from Vietnam, as soon as Vietnam filled up capacity, it started going into the rest of
yeah.
South Asia.
So
Um, yeah.
I hear good things about Vietnam today, where growing up, all of my Boy Scouts coaches were Nam vets, and when we would complain as Boy Scouts when I was like 10, they'd say, when I served in Nam, we spent a month in the jungle without a shower. You kids can handle this. And now, like in the hipster traveler digital nomad circles I was in after I dropped out, Vietnam's a big spot for travel people. It's considered an amazing country. Apparently, it's super cheap. It's pleasant. They're American allies now. The Southeast Asians are very polite. I care about politeness. I do give them credit for that. It's a place where you go there because I've lived in both Mexico and I've been in Thailand for a month, and they're roughly economically similar, I think. But Mexico is so much dirtier and so much crazier. And everything in Thailand works. It's nice. You can walk around a city, no one's going to bother you. The food's amazing. There's beautiful skyscrapers. So in Thailand, they have these 7-story malls, and they're just enormous. And it's like their town square. It's fucking hot all the time. And I was looking at this, and Thailand apparently has an economy vastly smaller than my home state of Pennsylvania. And I thought, the way we measure our numbers must be wrong if this 7-story mall is not accredited for like its
Yeah.
economic size.
Well, the economy of Thailand is Bangkok, essentially.
Huh.
Thailand is one of the strangest outliers in the world because if you have, you can track a level of development to a percent rural versus urban population,
Yeah.
and it's right within like a 5% margin. And Thailand is double the average rural
Yeah.
population per urban based on its level of development because it really is Bangkok. When we're talking about a lot of Thailand, we're talking about Bangkok. And I think it's because they have maybe they like France, they have a long-term pride in their farming and
Yeah.
agrarian society. So, um, and not all the areas, the rural areas funneled into Bangkok. So there's just still a large portion of the country
Yeah.
that's rural beyond its level of development.
So you lived in Southeast Asia for many years, and your job is that you worked in agriculture to basically, it's funny, I have an uncle who worked for Norman Borlaug. He's a wheat scientist.
Mhm.
And he did a similar thing to what you did. He traveled around the world getting people to use genetically modified wheat. And this is stuff when your family's from Nebraska. And so, what can you tell us about the way people live in traditional Southeast Asia and how it's different from what Westerners would expect?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time out there. We were doing vegetable seeds. There actually are no genetically modified vegetable seeds, or GMO ones because the market is so fractured. People
Yeah.
have preferences down to like a really small locality, and then there's more breeding constraints. But I sorry, what was the question?
What's traditional
Oh
life
yeah,
like
yeah. So I
for
spent
peasants and
a
stuff?
lot of time in every almost every state in India, Malaysia a bunch of times, Vietnam 5 times, Myanmar 4 times, all those countries, and there's a huge, huge similarity across all of them in
Oh,
terms of the small farming villages.
yeah,
Um, it's a lot of smallholder farmers, a lot of people, and then they split up the land between the kids, and it gets kind of smaller and smaller. There's basically, villages, farming villages, and then pretty basic huts. Um, and then you'll get like the level where like a village has maybe one motorcycle, and then the bigger, wealthier villages will have 5 motorcycles and a car.
yeah,
Um, and they always give you tea, like chai tea or something. Maybe they'll give you soda, like 7 Up or Coke. Um, and this was the same across like in Myanmar in the floating villages. They have these floating villages where they grow tomatoes
damn,
in rows on top of the water, like the Aztecs, the only other place they do that. And all their houses are on stilts. And the wealthiest guy in the village, his house, it was just completely decked out, head to toe, and Disney memorabilia, just
yeah,
Disney rugs, Disney toys. That was a big status symbol. Um, yeah, so like a lot of what I saw was more defined around, like we said, the similarities in terms of what happens in an industrial society versus detecting the real cultural differences beyond the slight differences in design. Like the life felt overall fairly similar.
yeah, yeah. It's interesting you say that. An interesting book I read was Europe Emerges by Reynolds, and it's an economic history of the rise of Europe to global industrial predominance. And it starts with the Dark Ages, and then it goes until Europe hit the Industrial Revolution. And the thesis of the book is he said the average person across Europe in the year 1700 or 1000 AD lived a pretty similar life. If you looked at a French peasant or a German peasant, they'd have a lot of similarities, but they were pitted against each other in constant war and saw each other as very different. And so, were these two questions? Were these people freeholders? Did they have a lord, or secondarily, were they happy?
Um, yeah, so they seemed relatively happy. I mean, Thailand has the motto of being a happy country, like you said. But yeah, because there was rapid change. All these guys
Yeah.
were experiencing rapid change, and a lot of happiness is relative to direction
Yeah.
rather than where you are. So yeah, a lot of and this is like the lower level farming villages. There's also a ton of bigger projects. There, I saw insane high-tech greenhouses all across like the hills in Malaysia, pitched at a 45-degree angle.
Yeah.
Um, like there's very sophisticated agriculture as well. It's just a big mix. I think I got away from the question again.
Yeah. And the I find just rural people tend to be happier than city people on average, or happy is not the right word. They have a greater sense of direction in their life because I've lived in rural areas, I lived in cities, and rural Americans are often not happy. They're often dissatisfied with their lives because their lives are often not good. But they at least have this sense of reality and this sense of belonging to a certain thing. And I find that around the world.
Yes, so like they're more conservative, but that reminds me of another overlap between American rural villages, right? Where you have the townies, and then you have the people who live 10 minutes outside of town
Yeah.
on the farm, and there's kind of different cultures that develop around there. And there is a big kind of like um, hopeless, rural, drug dance party vibe
Yeah,
element in
yeah.
Thailand that is similar to like you see a lot of self-destructive behavior in rural areas in the
Yeah,
US.
I saw that growing up too. It's especially pronounced in New England, I find, where there's this like archetype of, and I knew these people. And there's the archetype of like a guy who spends all his money on like 10 horses he can barely maintain, and he just like has the horses as his hobby, and it's completely self-destructive. Um, and so we need to actually, this is what we always do. We ramble at anthropology, and then I talk about the actual state formation after half an hour. um and I'm fine with that. I like the system. um I like the system in this case, not in normal cases. And Angkor Wat came about due to the trade influence with Champa up the Mekong. And Angkor, the Cambodians, or the Khmer, as they called themselves, they formed the first great empire in this region. And they conquered a huge area stretching from Bangkok out to the mouth of the Mekong. And Angkor was a slave state. And literally, like three-quarters of the population were slaves. And we know of Angkor Wat, which is the biggest structure in the world. I think it literally is. It's just huge temples. And Angkor was a Hindu civilization. And the Hindus and the Buddhists fought over Southeast Asia. Some places were Hindu, other places were Buddhist. Um, and they formed the Khmer identity out of a series of different groups. And they were the greatest empire. And people were in awe of their scale. But then over the course of the 1200s, they fell apart for normal empire reasons. That being degeneracy, barbarian invasions, plague. And then Angkor fell apart and they abandoned Angkor Wat. And Angkor is this interesting outgrowth of Indian civilization long after India. By the time we get to the Middle Ages, India had kind of decayed, and Angkor was actually the last great breakthrough in Hindu monarchy. And the rest of early modern Southeast Asian history is the gobbling up of former Cambodia, where Vietnam and Thailand came into the void out of the collapse of Angkor, where the Thais were a tribe from Yunnan who migrated down until they hit the area around Ayutthaya. Ayutthaya is the medieval area of Thailand. And the Thai identity formed in the 15 and the 1600s, where there were people called the Miao, and this is hilarious, where the Miao were the population between the Irrawaddy and the mouth of where Bangkok is, and they were a swamp people. And so the Burmese and the Thais kind of consumed the Miao. And this is the thing about Southeast Asia. There's the Karen people of North Thailand. The Karen have been at war with the Thai government and the Burmese government because they're a hill people. And we'll talk about the hill people later. I've got some stories there. But I would joke that my hometown is on the edge between Karens and rednecks, that this is the anthropological division. And that's another Karen tribal war. But the Thai state, they were the people who were most interested in taking European technology. And so over the course of the early modern period, Southeast Asia became even more inextricably linked into the global system, where there was a period, especially in the 1300s. The 1300s was this region's golden age due to the Silk Road, where this was the wealthiest place in the world in the early modern period due to the immense cost of spice. And the Thais are people who hacked into this trade system. And even today, it's clear that Thailand is the country in Asia that is most interested in Western, or the eastern half of Asia, I'm not counting Dubai, that is most interested in looking at Western stuff and taking in foreign interest. In the Thai monarchy, their evolutionary strategy was basically getting stuff from abroad. So they had the largest artillery connection, the most Western artillery of any country in the region. And the Chinese started migrating into this region over this time period. And the Chinese were there to do merchant jobs, to run businesses, that stuff. And you'll often see hilarious omissions in history books. Where in Victor Lieberman's book, he was talking about Thailand's economy in the early modern period, and he said, hey, it wasn't true the Chinese drove all the economic progress. We have records of a handful of Thai entrepreneurs. I'm just like, kill me.
Well, it's the same thing with the king, right? If you look
Yeah,
at the way they teach the history of the king, and a lot of it is royal family propaganda, which
yeah,
now I
yeah,
criticize on social media, but they basically like give him credit for industrialization, like it was his idea.
yeah,
Like, um, even though, he was good in opening up Thailand to those political changes, it's I mean, and it makes sense because just from their perspective, you have this king. This is what the country looks like at the beginning of his reign. This is what the country looks like at the end of his reign. Wow, that guy is amazing. It
yeah.
basically, the interpretation can be as simple as that on some level.
The reason Thailand industrialized is because Liu Chen moved there from Guangdong. And and so the Chinese demographic expansion across Southeast Asia is enormous. And so I think something like a quarter of Thai ancestry is of Chinese origin. And the Chinese moved across the whole region, and they've often been called the Jews of the Orient because they are hated by the local populations. Because
Yeah,
there's this,
everywhere across
yeah,
Asia, the wealthiest people are Chinese, and it was from the trade, before
yeah,
they closed themselves off in the 1600s. So there's been a long time since the Chinese populations in those countries have been disconnected from mainland China,
yeah,
but they still persisted as this class post
yes.
Chinese
And
retreat.
the Chinese in Southeast Asia are considered purely Chinese, where with diasporas are really interesting. And yeah, I should read Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell may be the best anthropologist of the last century, and he has multiple books on diaspora cultures. And in China, in Southeast Asia, they are often more Chinese than China itself because they're taking this culture from the 1800s and they don't mix with the local population that much, except for Indonesia and Thailand are the two places they mixed. And even when the Chinese did assimilate, the local population did discriminate against them. And you look at these countries, they have racial quotas where the local population needs to get certain amount of jobs. And you look at the STEM programs, the entrepreneurs, they're like 95% Chinese innately. And then they try to have these diversity programs for the majority population. And a lot of the politics of this region is built off the resentment of the Chinese, where you look at the communist struggles in 1960s Indonesia or the communist struggles in 40s Malaya is that they were all Chinese people. And the Chinese were using communism as a wedge. This is much like the Jews in Europe. I shouldn't have opened that can of worms, but because they were trying to get a universalistic ideology where you can jump past them being a discriminated and hated ethnic minority. And so if you look at this region, the Chinese have been instrumental in almost every single economic side of things, a lot of the development, and there's a mutual loathing where the Chinese view the locals with contempt, and then the locals see the Chinese as extractive and cruel and manipulative. And so you're looking at this region in the year 1700. The Vietnamese were a former Chinese colony, and the Chinese gave them a condescending nickname like our little South Chinese brother, where they're just like, "Oh, you're not a real country." And the Chinese held them as a colony from the birth of Christ, if they conquered Dongsong, and then until Dongsong's hilarious, but until 1000 AD, when the Vietnamese fought a heroic war against the Chinese. And when you look at Vietnam beating America, they have fought off 27 Chinese invasions in the last 1,000 years. This is how they could beat us. They have the fucking grit. And if you look at the map of Southeast Asia on a civilizational basis, Southeast Asia is really hard to map because there's this for civilizational cultural differences, because there's this underlying current of universality where a farmer in Burma, as you said, is pretty close to a farmer in Java. But then you have the Muslim bloc, you have the Buddhist bloc, you have the Chinese bloc, and Vietnam is the state it's Confucian Chinese. They look Chinese. They use the bureaucracy and the test taking system to make their elite. They were modeling themselves off Chinese political philosophy. And Vietnam is somewhat like Canada, where their oppositional relationship to the bigger country is their entire identity. Where Canada is different from America, but then their entire identity is not being America. And so Vietnam is predicated upon this kind of relationship. And at the Red River, which is also a river in Texas, where did you have a fun story at the Red River farmers, right? But they conquered all the way down the Mekong to former Champa in the 1700s, and the Vietnamese state finally crystallized from warring states in the 1700s, and then they teamed up with the Thais to dismember Cambodia in the manner of Poland Lithuania, where the Thais had this state that encompassed Cambodia. Laos was a powerful state, which sounds fake, but it was. They had huge, very strong elephant armies. It was called Lan Shan, and it was very hard for the Thais to beat them. And Chiang Mai was a Burmese colony. Chiang Mai is North Thailand. And the Burmese formed into their own state, where they had an empire that briefly went from Arakan out to Chiang Mai. And then the Thais beat the Burmese. So in this constant level of squabbling states, Thailand, Burma, Vietnam crystallized. Malaysia and Indonesia was jungle. You had various states in Indonesia with the Srivijaya state. And these Indonesian states were predicated upon trading across the region with maritime empires. And Srivijaya was based off Sumatra, which is one of the big islands. It's where King Kong's supposedly from. And so Srivijaya formed a state, but then they grew degenerate and corrupt, and then Mataram arose. And Mataram was a Muslim state in Java based off the merchants. It's funny that Southeast Asia was an innately capitalist society at the beginning, but it's also one of the most anti-capitalist societies in the world. You know exactly what I mean, where it's,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's like every country does this, right? Like in Africa, when they go towards the Soviets, when they have the colonial resentment,
Yeah,
they find something in their history to explain it, right? They have, oh, we have these tribal traditions. They fit with this collectivist thing. And but then those same countries can also decide to go capitalist and be like, hey, our history was
yeah,
capitalist. Look, we had these great trading empires. And it's the same thing in Southeast Asia, where you can find both in your history and choose to define yourself off of
yeah.
whatever you want.
And tropical cultures tend to build their societies around interpersonal relationships, and then the colder the climate is, the less interpersonal the culture is. And um, so in Southeast Asia, there's some interesting anthropology here because it's the opposite of the West, where in the West you define your character through individuality, and in Southeast Asia it's through collectivism, where individuality is seen as immature in Southeast Asian culture, where,
Yes.
for example, you are your social class, you are your relationship to your parents, you are the town you're from, your job is to manifest your group identities as well as possible, and seeing behind the mask is seen as rude and immature. And so you look at these societies where, yes, they are capitalist in a certain sense, but they didn't develop the social institutions we associate with capitalism. So it was more like the Greeks and the Romans, where Southeast Asia, when the Europeans colonized it, was at like a civilizational level comparable to ancient Greece, where you have capitalist slaving elites who have huge amounts of slaves, and it's the master slave morality Nietzsche talks about. But Southeast Asia also doesn't have it's a very feminine society, and Southeast Asia is possibly the most feminine society in the world because it's all based around interpersonal relationships and subjectivity, and it's not as aggressive. Where in Southeast Asian culture, for example, you have all these different ways to de-escalate conflict, where it's one of the most, America's the most direct communication society in the world. Southeast Asia is the least, or Indonesia is the least. And so if you're speaking to a Southeast Asian person and you want to criticize the work they did for work, you would say, for example, oh, here is a magazine. One of my friends was working through it, but I don't think it's good enough. Would you mind reading through that? What that translates to the person is, write the magazine better, fucker.
Yeah. So I definitely came across this a ton. And this is part of the reason why I went to Asia,
Yeah.
because the economic growth was high, but also they have a huge middle management crisis
Yes.
because people will not do anything unless their boss tells them to do it.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and so you can get, a big career boost managing things right out of college. Um, but yeah, there was huge sensitivity around that. Any sort of like creative assertiveness is viewed as antisocial behavior.
Yeah.
I kind of leaned into it though because I was able to be outside of
You
the
were the jokester.
expectations
You
of the
were the, you were
society.
you were the court fool.
Yeah, exactly. Where it was like it was a bit of a full and advantageous dynamic where it's like, okay, that's just a different culture, but through doing that, I could show the utility and function of that way
Yes.
of behavior without it threatening the breakdown of their culture. It's like, okay, we're
Yes.
still going to act this way.
One of the best traits of Southeast Asia is they're less egoistic than the rest of Asia, where Asian societies fall into this issue where they are so obsessed with tradition that they lose the ability to actually interface with their environment. For India, they got obsessed with the caste system in Hinduism. For China, it was the bureaucracy. For Islam, it was the Quran. In each case, the Europeans wiped them out, and they weren't able to respond because they had gotten so obsessed with tradition. In Southeast Asia, they were the people who were best able to interface with foreign environments because they know that they're less than India or China. And so India was the first wave, and there were a lot of Hindus in that wave. And then Buddhism gained predominance across the region because it was impossible to interface the caste system in a Southeast Asia long term. Because the caste system is something that, in its Hindu context, can only work in India because it stems from the like racial demographics of how India already is. Southeast Asia, everyone's roughly the same ethnicity. And so they rejected the caste system. And Southeast Asia has a tendency to take another society's cultural forms and then chill them out. Where Chinese authors in the medieval period would be like, you guys are fucking savages. They would be like, you guys are not, the Vietnamese would study Confucianism and then mix it with local culture. And then all of the Indians and the Chinese and the Islamics would look at that and think, no, you're doing it wrong. You can't do that. And the example for this for the West, because the first wave was Indian and Hindu, around the time of the Dark Ages. Then there was the Chinese were just a force that kept spitting stuff out for thousands of years. Um, and then there was the Islamic influence in the Middle Ages, where the Muslims had gained control of the trade routes, where Hinduism made it illegal to leave India or to go on a boat in the late medieval period. So the Muslims who are trailing from, say, going from Oman and Persia, they took over all of the Malay archipelago. And the Malay archipelago is a useful anthropological term that no one says, but it's great because it's Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, New Guinea. It's that whole region. And so it's a great term because they're all ethnically Malay. And Malay was a trading language that developed. So the Indonesian language called Malay, these terms are all weird and warped by both nationalists and Marxists, so I will get this slightly wrong. That developed over the course of the early modern and medieval period because Indonesia's got at least 500 languages. And so you have to trade across the languages, and Indonesian is one of the easiest languages in the world. One of the one of the easiest languages to learn in the world because it was openly structured around merchants. And so the grammatical structure is the same as English, and it's all these pidgin words. And
Interesting. Yeah. Go ahead.
so the Muslims had been able to take over the region's culture over the early modern period. And something that sticks out to me, there's a great book called Pacific Worlds by Mark K. Mutsuda, and it's a history of trans-Pacific traffic. And I cannot overstate how good this book is, where it talks about all these historic facts I would never know about, like the Yankee fishermen who were hunting whales and fur trading in the Siberian Arctic in the 1800s, early in the 17 and 1800s. Or it talks about there was this Chinese gazillionaire in the 19th century who helped fund the American railroad system. And then what happened is that what occurred then is that he sent people from his hometown in China to America to work on the railroads. And then that hometown became the wealthiest state in China because the Chinese were sending money back from America. And there's all these incredible stories. And he talks about, for example, the lateen sail that the Europeans used from the Age of Discovery. to sail the New World around Africa, it was originally a Polynesian sail from New Guinea because the Polynesians were Southeast Asian peoples that kept going out into the Pacific, and they used this sail. The Muslims started using this sail, and the Spanish got it from the Muslims.
Oh wow, that's a huge innovation and kind of shows the connection through the seed trade as part of the Silk Road route.
Yeah,
A really funny story with an example of the moderating effect, right, is in Indonesia, where a lot of Southeast Asia has a fairly sexually open,
yeah.
uh, non-monogamous history, right? So, and adopting, but they didn't have alcohol. So when they adopted Islam, it became like today, it can be way more of a bad PR disaster for someone to be caught drinking alcohol than getting caught having an affair. But I think in the actual Middle East, it'd probably be the opposite.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
and then,
hilarious.
yeah, and then for the languages, the amount of languages, like you mentioned, there's still, I think, over 10 or maybe 20 languages in India spoken by over like 10 million people.
Damn,
And we were in some parts of India where we had four translators and we still could not communicate. We had
bruh.
English to Hindi to local language to another local language, and that guy, fourth guy, could not talk to the farmer. Um,
Yes,
it's
yes,
like it gets so long that it becomes a game of telephone, but for getting the telephone, we didn't have the language to communicate whatsoever.
yes. Um, the point I said makes me think of something where, for example, Western culture has had a bigger effect on Southeast Asia than most people realize, where the Highland peoples of Burma, who are currently fighting a guerrilla campaign against both the Thai and the Burmese government, where Southeast Asia has all these peripheral wars in which has all these peripheral wars at the edge where the centralized government tries to conquer hill peoples. And the Karen and the Shan are two peoples resisting, as an example. And they are all Baptists because preachers from the American South converted them to Baptist Christianity, and because they were resisting against the Buddhist centralized government. And Christianity has an ideology that believes in the soul, it believes in freedom. They're hearing it from Americans. Keep in mind, the Americans started the third bloodiest war in history, as this guy from Kentucky taught Christianity to a Chinese person in the Taiping Rebellion. And they also, so I read this book, it was really interesting. It's called Hello Shadowlands, and it's this lefty American journalist in Southeast Asia, and he goes to all these crazy things. He visited like a Malaysian terrorist group in Thailand fighting against the Thai government, and he's visiting these Shan Hill people. And what happened is that they said, is that the Shan, they were Baptists, and he was really triggered that their whole society faced addiction. And mental health issues and substance abuse addiction are horrible problems in Southeast Asia because their societies have changed so fast. And then secondarily, it's not a culture that values authenticity or opening up. So it's not a therapy culture. So you have stunningly poor drug issues in a lot of Southeast Asia. And these hill people
Mhm.
have opioid addicts, much like my home state of Pennsylvania. And these Baptist associations would take the opiate addicts, force them to go through withdrawal, and then put them into integrated village communities of former addicts where they live and work together. And the guy who was writing this book, this lefty journal, he's like, this is so terrible. I thought, these people are heroes. They're fighting for their own people's liberation. They're serving God. They're cleaning up addiction. They're taking care of their community. What don't you like?
Yeah, people who judge missionaries abroad do not understand the positive impact they make. Like
Yeah.
in Uganda, some guy at a market I was checking out asked, hey, are you Muslim or Christian? Muslim or Christian? I was like, we're Christian. My brother was like, oh, I don't know, like label Christian, but not
Yeah.
really. And he just started laughing and he was like, ha ha ha. That's because you haven't had real problems or real things to deal with.
Yes.
You'll figure it out. And as society is figuring it out, as it's starting to kind of collapse, people are like, oh, we better rediscover our values.
Yeah.
But did you say this? So, because I spent time with the Karen Hill, the rebels, the ones that lived on the border of Myanmar and Thailand, because one of
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
colleagues' parents spent a lot of time there in the 70s. He was from Hong Kong, and it was a big anarchy zone in the jungle between the two
Yes.
countries, and it still is kind of like that.
Oh.
And when I visited him, we explored like an unexplored cave and did all sorts of great. We shot guns. they had a bunch of guns, and then they also had pipe guns, and they made all their own ammo. And I got along really well with them. And now I'm thinking, hey, is this were they like Baptists at culture? Is that
Yeah. But the story is that one of my buddies has a Thai girlfriend, and he was telling me about her, and he said she was Christian. I said, yeah, she sounds like she's Karen. And then he asked his girlfriend, he's like, how did your friend know? We're ethnically Karen, but we pretend to be Thai. And so we've been holding it, but your friend figured it out. And I was like, that's cool. And so our buddy Dan, he was an anthropologist in Cambodia for years, and he has a lot of interesting stories. And that's a thing across Southeast Asia, where their nation building's relatively recent. And when I was in France, I would talk to people, and someone would have a Polish last name. Said, "Hey, you sound Polish. And are you ethnically Polish?" And they said, "Oh no, I'm French." I said, "But you have a Polish last name." And they said, "Oh yeah, my grandparents came from Poland." Or I'd tell them, "Oh, I'm an American, but I'm of English and Irish ancestry." They say, "But you're an American." And I said, "Yeah, but that's my blood. It's objectively my blood." And like my American diaspora populations are still their former diasporas, and they were just so stuck on national identity because in both Europe and Southeast Asia, nation building was a violent process where you had to take other ethnic groups. And so my buddy who lived in Southeast Asia, he said, "Oh yeah, like everyone will say, oh, I'm 100% Khmer, I'm 100% Thai," and then you start talking to them and like, "Oh no, you're a third Chinese, you're a quarter low, you're a quarter Miao, and you're like 5% Thai." And so that's a big process across this region. And Indonesia is a fascinating story. Same thing as Malaysia, because these were colonized by Europeans and they didn't have political identities before the Europeans. And so you have these national identities formed within living memory, where the Indonesian identity was formed organically after World War II due to the Dutch, because it was a Dutch colony, which we'll get to. But the Indonesians, they had to develop their identity after the war with the communists. And you look at Malaysia, Malaysia is also doing identity building where they were a bunch of tribes before the British showed up. And so Malay and Indonesian identity leans heavily on Islam because that's the big unifying force they have, where every major Southeast Asian people that didn't have a developed state by the time of 1600 AD either went Christian or Muslim, because Islam was eminently useful for the state building and the nationalism of Indonesia and Malaysia. And the Philippines is practically an extension of Latin America, where, keep in mind, and the Spanish were so fucking cool. They were colonizing the Philippines in like 1600 AD, right after they conquered Mexico. And it would literally take over a year to get orders from Manila to Madrid, but they still held it as a colony. And you see a lot of interesting stuff where, for example, there's a form of Spanish country music in the foothills of the Philippines. And the ruling class of the Philippines today is still people who are ethnically Spanish ancestry. And so you'll often meet Filipino people like Olivia Rodrigo. She's half white, half Filipino. Rodrigo's a Filipino last name. It's Spanish. She looks like she's Mexican or something. And so Spain had a colony in the Philippines, and in this early modern period, the Europeans entered Southeast Asia. And this was I got to give the Iberians credit. They were very impressive. The Portuguese sailed around Africa. They went to the Indian Ocean, and then they reached Indonesia. And they established a series of forts across the Southeast Asian region and the Indian Ocean region. When the Portuguese had forts in Mozambique, in Kenya, in Somalia, in Oman, in Iran, in India. They took Sri Lanka. They had Singapore. They had Java. They had East Timor. The Portuguese stole every single strategic position in the Indian Ocean nearly overnight, and they had this fort system. And the Portuguese got very wealthy for a small country in the 15 and the 1600s. And then the Spanish took them, and the Portuguese monarchy stagnated under the Spanish joint monarchy. And it's pretty impressive that the Portuguese, it was crews of like 500 guys at most, normally vastly less than this. And they took over the wealthiest trading system in the entire world overnight, where they were able to seize control uh, of this whole region, and the Dutch came after. And the Dutch's strategy was knocking out the Portuguese forts. And the Dutch had the most aggressive strategy of any European country colonially. And the Dutch were practicing VC capitalism. These merchant trading expeditions were funded by VC capital back in the Netherlands. So they're like, you can take Sulawesi, where the Dutch took Singapore, they took Sri Lanka, they took South Africa, and they had the Dutch got as far as Japan, and the Japanese liked the Dutch because the Dutch were all about money, and they didn't try to convert the Japanese because the Portuguese sparked a peasant revolt in South Japan that nearly toppled the monarchy, and because Christianity is dangerous to many regimes.
Right. Well, the reason that the Portuguese trips got funded was tied back to the spread of Catholicism, where
Yes.
the reason the Dutch trips got funded was to
Oh,
make us money. Like,
exactly.
and if it didn't become a monopoly and it was really more of an open market of competing colonial interests,
Yeah,
I think it
yeah.
would have been more interesting. But
So the Portuguese had long-lasting demographic effects in which, for example, there's this mixed Portuguese population around the whole region, and there's a group called the Lascars, who are kind of the sailor caste of the Indian Ocean. And the Lascars were a mix of Chinese, Malay, Portuguese, Indian blood. And that conservative fellow, Indian guy, who makes content in 2012 about why Obama. So you know that conservative Indian guy who made a documentary about if Obama won, it would kill America? I thought it was deranged when I was 11, but it was actually completely accurate. Who's that
oh
guy's name?
yes, I'm drawing a blank on it, but I know him very well.
He turned out to
So,
be correct. Yeah, so he is a Portuguese derived Christian from Goa because there was an earlier established Christian
oh,
community in Goa from the Roman period, and so uh, the Dutch stabilized the region where they took modern Indonesia. And it's often painful to look at the wars between Indonesia and between the Dutch. And Indonesia wasn't a unified country, where the Dutch would win battles outnumbered 10 to 1. And um, they built Jakarta just as a fort, and much like the British in India, it started as forts to trade. They had no intention in colonizing the region, and then the native wars dragged them in. And to protect their trade interests, they had to conquer all of Indonesia over the course of the 16 through 1800s, and they finally conquered Bali in the early 20th century, which was the last place that held out. And Bali's the only Hindu area of. I apologize for the background noise, but I don't control my neighbors. And so the Dutch, as an example, because the Dutch are like the English but more extractive, where Dutch colonialism did not do as well as the English, where, for example, New York versus New England. The Dutch didn't populate New York because it was all this short-term extractive stuff where there was no reason to move there. You become someone's tenant. In Indonesia, meanwhile, they just tried to rape the population as much as possible, where they took Sulawesi, the Clove Islands, or the Spice Islands, which were super wealthy, and they wiped out the entire ruling class. They destroyed the entire ecology of Sulawesi. And from that, they created basically no political institutions in Indonesia. And unlike the British, they didn't really have the intention of establishing long term control. And so Indonesia was worse governed. It was, as I said, pretty extractive. And then the Philippines was also pretty extractive. And I'm going to stop the story here with the British taking over India with the Napoleonic Wars, where the British took Malaysia and they took over India. And the British became the guarantors of the sea. And then in the late 1800s, in the last gasp of European colonialism, the British took Burma and the French took Vietnam and the Dutch were in control of Indonesia. And so all of Southeast Asia, except Thailand, was a European colony at the start of World War One.
right. And then that goes into the modern period, right, where they had kind of this changing. They had the nation formation, and then the changing societies, and then the with the colonial
Yeah,
relationships, and
yeah.
then the modernizing societies to the point where we are today, where they have relatively rapid growth. Although Thailand has been kind of outlier in that, it's been consistent 2% for a long
Yeah.
time.
There,
Philippines failed to take off like people anticipated because
yeah.
everyone thought the Philippines would be the first Asian country to develop because they had English speaking and
Yeah.
Spanish speaking, but mostly English speaking. Um, and it never did. It went to Japan, and then it was going to go to the Philippines after that, but then went to India
Yeah.
instead. And so the Philippines are still having a development crisis tied to their oligarchical nature. Like
Yes.
the five families still control everything.
There are a lot
Um, yeah.
They're like South America. Like I see a lot of similarities in Peru and the Philippines. So I'm just going to finish Southeast Asian history because we only have a century left. It'll take me a few seconds. The Philippines was an American colony, which we took from Spain around a little bit before World War One, and there was this really bloody war called the Moro War, which was a war of genocide. Not, it was a war of brutal subjugation of the Philippines Muslim population. And I wish wokies read enough to complain about this war. It annoys me the left doesn't complain about this war more because it fits all their boxes: colonialism, genocide, whatever. But they don't read about this stuff. And the Japanese briefly colonized the entire region in World War II, which invalidated the Europeans' hold on power. So the Europeans gave up all of their colonial possessions immediately after World War II. The French held on in Vietnam, but they lost. And then the region became divided between local independent regimes that had to go through a process of state formation. And the region went through some of the most rapid industrialization ever since the start of this century.
Yes, and that gets us to where we are now, where, I'm going over there looking at these high growth rates and exciting opportunities and like
Yeah.
thriving culture, and people are happy and optimistic about the direction things are going, and
Yes.
there's great energy. And at the same time, there's still a lack of bureaucracy, where the other thing that sold it to me was I was on a ship going out on a scuba tour, and I had those stabilizers in the
Yeah.
water. And I just crawled out on one and rode on the stabilizer of the ship, expecting to get yelled at, any second. And the captain didn't care at all. It was like
Yeah.
some insane thing I was doing. You can
We
climb a tree without worrying about a lawsuit. But I think things are starting to reverse, unfortunately, where they don't have a lot of the underlying cultural values to fight off the growth of the
yeah, yeah.
bureaucracy. And I think the dynamic maybe will reverse in the U.S., especially in red states or with some federalism. So that's why I popped back over here. But I'm hoping that they don't get too caught down in the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Like we said, they're following those patterns based on kind of a false understanding of our own history.
Yes. Um we've both lived abroad, and we've both lived abroad to return to America. And the best thing about America is the dynamism and the energy. And I also just like Americans as people. I think we're holistically a good people. We're smart, we're intrepid, we're generally moral. And the thing I hate about America is just the Karen bullshit. The whole stuff about just America puts up all these BS regulations that stop you from enjoying life, and I periodically test it. And people in America get so obsessive over such unimportant things. Like I'll leave my shoelaces untied in the elevator. And then someone will say you should tie your shoelaces, and I'm like, why is this your problem? Or biking around in Philly when I was a kid, people would fall into histrionics that I'd bike into a bad neighborhood for a few blocks. Just we've stopped living in America, and the great thing at the third world is that it's still like the story's going, and we just got tired and decided to stop playing the game in the West.
Yeah, it's like a retreat into an attempt to eliminate uncertainty once you've satisfied yourself
Exactly.
on other dimensions or something. But it's also just a political misunderstanding, right? And their oligarchies and their corporate interests are very interested in forming these
Yeah.
regulatory structures that are going to keep them in power, and it's going to lower growth. And then you're going to run into some big problems where you have all this huge population growth and energy that suddenly has nowhere to go.
Yeah.
So I think it's important that the U.S. goes through with Doge really wipes out our bureaucracy and gives an example to the rest of the world of like what's actually
Yes.
behind um, human flourishing.
One of the conversations Austin and I had a few days ago is I was saying that the West exporting leftism to the third world through our universities was so disastrous. Because you look a century ago, all of the developing world's leaders, Africa, India, China, they all went to school at places like Oxford or the Sorbonne, and they were educated by these demented leftists who told them the worst advice. Then these elites went back to their home countries, gained independence, and then it held them back so much. And to be frank, these countries are corrupt. They're looking for rationalizations to be corrupt. But we shouldn't have told them that advice. Because you look at Africa, where they implemented socialism in the 20th century, which kept Africa super poor, or you look at Latin America. Cuba, Venezuela used to be rich countries, and they implemented socialism. And it's our fault for, as the West, for giving these developing countries the worst possible advice. And part of me cynically wonders if it's some kind of mate suppression, where we purposely gave them different advice from what made us rich to keep them in poverty.
That's a great point. I've thought about that a lot too,
Yeah,
because they actually don't want probably these huge population growths to continue.
yeah,
But the destabilization of all those societies would be like the biggest disaster you could imagine.
yeah,
And it's amazing that people make fun of, U.S. Christian missionaries who have an enormously positive impact in terms of asserting values of individual sovereignty and different things like that around the world and
yeah,
better values. While they ignore like the European NGOs who spread propaganda. So I in college had to take a sociology class, right? And for one of the classes, the teacher showed us a documentary about Indian farmers protesting BT cotton. They were
yeah.
protesting outside of a building. And then I asked my dad about it because he was involved in BT Cotton back in the day. He was like, "Oh yeah, I was in that building." The what it was there was no organic protest. It was European NGOs gave a bunch of free food out to get
Yeah,
a crowd to show up and protested, claiming that it was terrible for the farmers when it reduced the suicide rate by half, which
damn,
is already double the factory suicide rate, like we talked about.
damn,
Um, and these suicide rates are probably lower than ours, on some level. So, like the baseline is some people kill themselves.
yeah.
Um,
It's
um, but yeah, it was a total fraud, and it was taught in this college class to Americans as if it was the reality. The teacher playing the documentary probably didn't know
yeah.
any better. Yeah.
I'm gonna finish with this, but it reminds me of a conversation my dad had with my sister when we were kids. My sister's she's a Maoist, she's very environmentalist, and my dad is politics pretty similar to me. And my sister was talking about the need for developing countries to basically curtail we basically need to curtail the growth of CO2 emissions around the world. And my dad said, no, if you curtail CO2 emissions, you're sticking billions of people in poverty forever. And he said, you don't get to do that. He said, it's not fair. It's not fair that we as the West got rich and then we cut everyone else off. And he said, quote, because we're talking environmentalism too with like lions and tigers and
Yes.
lions and animals in Africa. And he said, yeah, we killed all the bison. We can't say anything. And so I am going to stop with there. This was a great episode. So next episode, I was going to do ancient Israel, but instead I want to do the medieval fossilization of Asia. So next episode is the period from 1000 AD until like 1600, when all the major Asian civilizations stalled while Europe rose. Why did Asia stall? That's the next video.
That's a good question. And speaking of stalling, if you care about the environment, keeping a society stuck in the bottleneck
Yeah.
moment where you have enough technology to grow your population, but not to innovate beyond just using all of your resources in an unproductive way is just the worst thing for any
Yes.
potential environmental outcome. So don't do
Okay.
that.
Sounds good.
All right. See you guys.
Bye.